Bright QT. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. So let's start our chapter number 3, and the chapter's name is Nationalism in India. Now before this, students, you already have heard the term that is nationalism, and we have talked about nationalism in context of Europe, as well as we talked about the region that is Indo-China. So in your first 2 chapters, you dealt with these 2 regions, that is Europe and Indo-China. Now here in this chapter, we are going to talk about our own country, right? So in this chapter, we are going to understand how the feeling of nationalism, it rose in the people, among the people who were living in our country. During which period? During the colonial rule in our country. Now, before understanding the main movements that took place in the 19th century, let us go back and just rewind ourselves as in what you have read earlier. Now, in your earlier classes, students, you already have learnt about many regional revolts. That can be the tribal revolts or the famous revolt of 1857. But were those revolts nationalist in nature? No. So here we are going to understand how this feeling of nationalism, it arose among the people who were living here, and it was against the British government. So we can say that this struggle with colonialism led to the discovery of unity among people. Definitely, there were several revolts that took place against the British government in our country, right? So like I told you, there were many tribal revolts, there were many regional revolts, as well as the famous revolt of 1857, right? As the name suggests, it took place in the year 1857. So therefore, it was only this struggle with colonialism, the struggle against the British rule. The term colonialism is again not new for you, right? So this struggle against the British rule, it brought people together. All the people, all the citizens of our country, they came together to fight against one single enemy. And who was that? The colonial rule. So the sense of being oppressed brought people from different backgrounds to fight for the common cause. Now, what was the common cause for all these people? Everyone, they wanted freedom or independence. So therefore, in this chapter, we are going to understand this struggle for independence against the colonial rule or the British government. So in large, what we can say here? We can say that this sense of nationalism in India, it began with the anti-colonial sentiments. So the term anti-colonial, what does that mean here? It means against the colonial rule. Basically, the sentiments that rose against the colonial rule. So therefore, in short, after understanding these 3 points here, you can definitely say that it was only this anti-colonial feeling that led to the emergence of this feeling of nationalism in our country. So here, before understanding about the different movements that took place under the leadership of Gandhiji, we are going to understand some of the other factors that led to the rise of nationalism. And here one of these factors was First World War. Yes. Now, in your last chapter as well, you have learnt about the First World War and the Second World War, right? So here we are going to see how this First World War, it had impacted our country, India. Now you are obviously aware of this timeline for the First World War. That is from 1914 to 1918, correct? So here, how was India impacted? So you must be knowing that Britain also participated in the war, correct? There were two powers. One was the Central Axis and the other was the Allied power. Right, students? And the victorious power was the Allied power. So here Britain was directly involved in the First World War. But it was somehow impacting our country as well. Why? Because India was a colony for this British colonial rule here. Right? So let us see some of the points or the impact of the First World War in our country. So it led to huge increase in defense expenditure. Definitely, when we are talking about wars, we need arms and ammunitions, right? So therefore, the colonial government, they had to increase the defense expenditure in order to buy these arms and ammunitions for the war. Custom duties were raised and income tax was introduced. Yes, now see, they had this huge increase in defense expenditure. But how were they going to pay for these arms and ammunitions? So they decided to increase the custom duties, to increase the taxes that people had to pay in our country. Definitely, this was a grim situation for the people living in our country. Why? Because it burdened the people. And why were they burdened? So they were burdened because they had to pay high taxes. And these people, the poor people, they could not afford that. Apart from this, there was price rise. Definitely, the prices of all the commodities, the common commodities that were being used in daily life, it was also increased. Next point here is the forced recruitment of the villagers. It led to resentment. Yes, students. Now, when we are talking about the war, obviously, army is going to fight in the war, right? So here what were we seeing? We were seeing that these British people, they were now forcing the villagers to join the army. Therefore, this forced recruitment of all the villagers who did not want to join the war, it led to resentment among the common people, among the villagers who were then forced. And the last point here is acute shortage of food and influenza epidemic. At the same time, what are we seeing? We see that there is the scarcity of food and rise in epidemics, right? So here we are seeing that people are not able to get adequate food, right? So the food shortage is now leading to influenza epidemics. Diseases are now spreading around and people, they were suffering a lot. Not only this, again, since we are talking about the shortage of food, it meant that famines, they came in this region, they occurred in this region, and it somehow impacted the lives of the Indians who were living there. And all these factors combined, it led to this rise of this feeling of nationalism among the common people. Against whom? Against the British rule here. During this period, students, now we are shifting our talk here. Now, after understanding the situation after the First World War, or what were the factors that led to the rise of nationalism in our country, we are going to talk about one important person here. And you must be aware of his name, that is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Yes, students. So in this chapter, we are going to understand how these movements were initiated by none other than Gandhiji, who is the father of our nation, right? So he introduced this idea of Satyagraha in India. Now again, let's go back to some important points that have not been mentioned in the book. So what happened? Now when we are talking about the First World War or the time before that, we see that there is no serious leadership in our country. Where? Among the Congress people. So after the Surat split that happened in the year 1907, there was no serious leadership and people were divided, right? So some people had different opinions, other people had different opinions, right? So the opinions of people were also divided and there was no leadership in our country. So during that period, the common people, they were also confused as in whom to follow. And also this resentment against the British rule, it was rising among the common people. And it was during this period, that is in the year 1915, that Gandhiji, he returned back to India from South Africa. So he also brought this idea of Satyagraha, about which we are going to understand in this topic here. So in January 1915, Mahatma Gandhi, he came to India from South Africa. As you can see in the image, people were quite happy and they welcomed Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi already had become a renowned figure in South Africa. Why? Because he introduced this idea of Satyagraha there. And now when he came back to India, he again applied this knowledge or this idea of Satyagraha in these movements. So he saw the chaos in this political arena, conditions of Indians, and then he decided to launch his novel method in India called Satyagraha. Now, what do we understand by this term Satyagraha, students? So, if we break this term, the first term is Satya and the second term is Agra. So, if we combine it, what does that mean? It means holding on to truth. And in short term, we call it as the truth force. Correct? So this was the basic meaning of Satyagraha. Now let us try to understand this meaning here. Satyagraha was non-violent, non-cooperation against the unjust and oppressive government. Yes, students, a very powerful tool that was introduced by Gandhiji in our country. Now, when he came back to India, he saw the chaotic situation in our country, when people were really confused as in whom to follow and what ideas should they use against the British government, right, to challenge the system. So here Gandhiji, he took on the leadership, right, and he introduced this idea of Satyagraha that he had already applied in South Africa. Now we have to understand the meaning of Satyagraha. So it was a non-violent, non-cooperation that was against the unjust and the oppressive rule or the oppressive government. So basically, Gandhiji emphasized on two things here, and you're already aware about those two terms. The first one is truth and the second one is non-violence, right? So basically, it was against this government, the oppressive and unjust government, who were now becoming a threat for the people living in our country, right? So Gandhiji turned it into a mass movement and strengthened the Congress organization. Definitely, after the Surat split, now there was this division in the moderates and extremists. Now you are already aware about these terms, right? So the two factions here in Congress was the moderates and the extremist group. So he wanted to strengthen the Congress organization. He wanted to implement this idea of Satyagraha among these people, right? The idea that was totally new for the people and a complicated idea that was really difficult to understand until you are not going into the depth of that word, right? So there were 5 virtues that Gandhiji talked about in Satyagraha. Now the first virtue was spinning. Again, as you can see in this image, Gandhiji with his charkha, because he emphasized on wearing the khadi cloth, right? So he emphasized on spinning. Removal of untouchability, that was again prevalent during that period. Non-consumption of alcohol. Hindu-Muslim unity and equality. These were the 5 virtues that Mahatma Gandhi wanted each and every person to follow. that the Hindu-Muslim should unite in order to fight against or challenge the British government. And also, there should be equality among the people living in our country. Right? So, you must remember these 5 virtues here. He also emphasized on the power of truth and the need to search for truth. Yes, students. Now, like I told you, while we are talking about Satyagraha, it meant truth force. So, basically, he emphasized on this power of truth. Now, if you are a true person, your cause is true, no one can defeat you. And you should not need violence in order to fight the oppressor. So these were some of the main ideas of Satyagraha that Gandhiji wanted to emphasize on. It suggested that if the cause was true, if the struggle was against injustice, then physical force was not necessary to fight the oppressor, like I told you right now. So he said that if you are fighting the British government and you know that the government is unjust to you, they are passing the laws that are not good for the common people, the citizens of our country. So you can definitely fight for the unjust rule there, for the oppressed rule there, right? And you should force the oppressor to see the truth, right? You should not apply violence there, not apply physical force there, but through the idea of non-violence and the power of truth, you can win the fight. These were some of the ideas that was followed by Mahatma Gandhi. But it was quite difficult for the people to understand the depth of or the meaning of Satyagraha. So therefore, there were some people who followed Gandhiji instantly. But again, there was this other faction who did not understand the power of Satyagraha. Right, students? So he also told that Satyagrahi could win the battle through non-violence by appealing to the conscience of the oppressor. Definitely. Anyone could win the battle when they are trying to appeal the conscience of the oppressor. That what they are fighting for is truth, and it is through the path of non-violence. People, including the oppressors, had to be persuaded to see the truth, like I told you right now. And instead of being forced to accept the truth through the use of violence. Totally, he wanted that no one should be violent to their oppressors. That would be really, really wrong. Gandhiji also believed that this dharma of non-violence could unite all the Indians. Yes. Now he thought that the idea of Satyagraha is going to act as a binding force for all the Indians. This one feeling, this one ideology is going to unite all the Indians. Now, was he correct? We are going to understand it through all the movements that were led by Mahatma Gandhi and the powerful tool of Satyagraha that was used in those movements. Now, coming to our exercise section, students, let us see some of the questions related to this topic. So, in very short answer questions, there is a question: when did Gandhiji return from South Africa? We just learnt it right now. The answer here would be January 1915. So, in January 1915, Mahatma Gandhi, he returned from South Africa to India. So, this would be your answer here. Second question is, what is Satyagraha? Now, we learnt about it right now. So, if you want to give the specific meaning here, you can say that Satyagraha, it means holding on to truth or truth force. Also, it is a non-violent, non-cooperation movement against the unjust. So, I am writing the keywords here: unjust and oppressive government. So, this would be your answer since it is in very short answer questions. Next question here is in short answer question. The question says, Write any two principles of Satyagraha. Yes, students. So in this question, what do you have to write? We are talking about the principle of Satyagraha. You have to emphasize on the power of truth or truth force. You also have to talk about how Gandhiji insisted that by using non-violence methods, right, and emphasizing on truth, the oppressor could change their mind, right? So basic principle was the use of truth and non-violence. So you have to expand the answer writing about how the powerful tool of truth and non-violence can change the conscience of the oppressor, right? So you should not force the oppressor of accepting the truth or seeing the truth through non-violence, but through violence. It should be only through non-violence that this idea should be emphasized among the oppressor or the unjust government, right? So you have to write this. So you have to write this part in this answer here in short answer questions.